Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented in the 16th week of 2014 by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's April 15th, the first day of Passover and Income Tax Day in the U.S., a day of reckoning, perhaps. Our subject is terrorism and what can be done to combat it. It's hard for U.S. citizens to admit that by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is that being run by the Obama administration, not by those we usually call terrorists. U.S. terrorism is not just Obama's drone strikes, which have killed 5,000 people, including 200 children. It's also the activities of the U.S. Special Operations Command, essentially the president's private army of some 70,000 who are active, according to their own spokesman, in more than 130 countries around the world. Their activities include kidnapping, which we call rendition, torture, and murder. It's part of the policies pursued by this and earlier administrations that have plagued the world with war and destruction. Not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, the 1%, who have gotten 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. Most Americans don't realize that Obama is carrying out the most extreme global campaign of terror in living memory, in part because the media downplay it and accept the Obama administration's flat lies that the war is winding down. We'll talk about that tonight with help from commentaries from Ron Zoke, The Hawks Scream and the Eagle Stirs, David Green on post-campaign reflections, and comments from Karen Evans-Levy. There are at least two important stories on Obama's global assassination campaign this week. First, the FBI joins with the Special Operations Command to send U.S. death squads around the world. The source for this is an article, surprisingly enough, in the Washington Post, although it did appear in the news hole in the weekend or the end of the week edition, where traditionally embarrassing stories are not supposed to be noticed. The second story is the U.S. war in Africa, which the first African-American president has vastly expanded, once again without the knowledge of most Americans. We'll come back to these if there's time, but we'll begin tonight with the candidate for the Democratic nomination for Congress, David Green, the only candidate, as a matter of fact, who's also a member of Aware, and who presented to voters of the 13th Congressional District a position on the war sharply at variance with the other two candidates in that race, the organizational candidates, who both reflected the administration's position on the war. And we'll get David to talk about his experience and what he thinks, where he thinks the anti-war votes should go in the upcoming election.
Is that what you're going to tell us?
Gosh, that's a tough one.
Yes, isn't it? We should talk about why it's a tough one. Probably.
Yeah, I'm going to make a few irreverent comments first, poking fun at myself and perhaps others regarding this campaign. There was an article, Tom Kasich in last Sunday's newspaper referred to a New York Times Magazine article which referred to Ann Callis, who was the winner in the Democratic primary. And the article in the New York Times Magazine was written by a journalist named Mark Leibovich, I think it is, and who's pretty well known. He's been interviewed by Bill Moyers. He's done a lot of work on sort of Washington, the corrupt politics of Washington and money in Washington. And so he had a go at Ann Callis in a fairly entertaining article in which he talked about how it is that politicians have to produce, whatever their personal background is and whatever privileged circumstances they may have grown up in, they have to produce a narrative of having in some way, either them or their parents, or if necessary, their grandparents having encountered poverty. And this is true in the case of Ann Callis. She had to go all the way back to her grandparents to find any, which is true for a lot of us. I mean, you know, it sort of depends how old we are, but I was interested. Yeah, I was interested to find out that one of the themes that Mark Leibovich in this sort of not very serious article referred to is that it helps if you've washed dishes. Apparently, even people like Marco Rubio or whatever are any dish that they have washed during their life apparently is fodder for their political narrative, and I just have to kick myself because I went through this whole campaign. I washed dishes at 2 restaurants in high school and all the way through college, and there was some real dishwashing going on between the ages of 16 and 23 in my life, and I did not know to refer to it in this campaign, and I think I missed an opportunity, which next time I will not miss. Okay, so
I'll make the same mistake.
I don't think that you know, Tom Kasich, to be slightly more serious, but not a whole lot more serious. I don't think Tom Kasich is really, you know, he said that this article in the New York Times was sort of outing Ann Callis as a privileged person, but I don't think she was ever in as anything else. It's just that you know, that really wasn't being talked about in the primary, and probably won't be being talked about in a whole lot in the general election either. She is probably somewhat more privileged than from a somewhat more privileged background than Rodney Davis, but I don't think at this point either of their, you know, neither of the glass houses in which they live can tolerate any stones of that nature being thrown from it. So what they will be talking about, it seems to me, they will be scoring points, as one can expect, in a very narrow range of issues or pretended differences in whatever issues, probably surrounding which one of them is going to defend Social Security the best or defend Medicare the best, and there really won't be. I don't think that Ann Callis is going to score a whole lot of points. I think Rodney Davis can probably protect himself pretty well in that regard. But in terms of foreign policy, I guess the one reflection, to be ever more serious as I go through my narrative here, the one reflection that I'll have about the campaign itself is that the foreign policy wasn't really spoken about all that much. I mean, both of my opponents avoided, George Gollin and Ann Callis, avoided the issue except to say that they supported veteran services. I never realized veteran services was kind of a substitute for actually having a foreign policy, but it sort of served that purpose in this case to sort of to send the signal that I'm a patriot, that I am on board with sort of the general patriotic thing, and from there it was. I think beyond that, I would say that at the times when I had the opportunity to raise the issue, or just the fact that I was clear about it on my website and I was clear about it in the articles I wrote, the letters that I wrote, there wasn't any critical response to what I was saying. I mean, we're beyond a point in our society where, at least in a Democratic primary, you can score any points by accusing the other person of not being warlike enough, of not supporting the military enough in their actual actions, as opposed to vets. So it became a kind of non-issue, and I probably could have done more in a more pointed way to make it a real issue and really put it on the table out there. But then again, the opportunities for doing that were fairly limited, and my opponents weren't really biting in that regard. I think that the change, and you could sort of throw in the issue of Israel-Palestine, which I referred to in my campaign, and am known for my dissenting views on that. That I could have seen 20. First of all, I'm not grandiose enough to think that either of my opponents had to focus on me and had to find anything about me. their tactic was to ignore me, and that's an understandable tactic, and that's what they did, and I accept that. But the fact that I could be sort of anti-Zionist or anti-Israel and not have it commented upon, not only by the other candidates, but in the media at large, probably tells you something. Insofar as I was taken seriously at all, I would have thought that somebody would have said, where is this guy coming from? I was asked about it once by Bernie Schoenberg, who was the main political reporter of the State Journal Register in Springfield, and a fellow Jew, a fellow tribe member, and he kind of cajoled me about it a little bit during the interview that we had out there. But it didn't amount to much, and I think it's a sign of the times that both foreign policy and issues in general and the Israel-Palestine issue in particular didn't arouse any controversy in this campaign. So I'll just, I'll leave it there and engage if, I don't know if you all want to engage any further in terms of what my experience was or what my views are. I guess the sum of all this is that foreign policy and war and our militarism won't be talked about in the general election campaign.
Yeah.
And that's too bad.
Whole new sense of Passover for the.
That's right.
Just pass
I guess
over
you might call this the unleavened version of aware on the air.
Definitely. Yeah.
My sense after being at some of the debates and stuff was that both Gollum and Callis had no idea even how to talk about foreign policy. And I could be wrong. They could just be avoiding it because they didn't want to bring up the obvious, or also because they didn't want to stir up controversy. Yeah. But I really think that they have no deep understanding beyond what they had read on your website. Like they hadn't looked into it enough on their own to come up with an opinion that was clear, or even know what to bring up. Mm-hmm. That's why they didn't bring it up. And so I really fear for us.
Well, the process, there was no structure in the process that really allowed, that sort of put their feet to the fire to a certain extent, that showed that they have an understanding of foreign policy, except for them to say, well, I'll be very careful about if we want to go to war, I'll gather all the data and decide on that basis. But you're right, Karen, in saying that, clearly they don't have a critique of U.S. foreign policy, okay, in the sense that I would consider having a critique, and that isn't surprising. I'm coming from somewhere else in that regard, namely Chomsky land, and so there really wasn't. It isn't so much that there wasn't things to, it isn't that we don't agree on certain things or we see the world differently. Just there isn't a discourse with which to engage an understanding of what it is we're doing around the world and what the underlying motives of that. I'm sorry. Maybe shouldn't get underlying motives. What the interests involved. In that.
Well, and if they do, if war comes up again for them. Because it will, if whoever gets elected, then they will do the research then. They've never done it in the past. What makes you think that they're going to actually do it then? And I really don't understand how the election system works, where what it takes to get elected has absolutely nothing to do with what you are going to be expected to do once you get there. Sorry. Because I think you would be awesome there. I think you have studied this stuff.
I'd be one person, but it would be a good voice. But anyway.
Yes. Sorry.
Thanks.
So you need to punch up your personal narrative, David.
Yeah, that absolutely.
Start claiming that
I need to get
Well, you were born on a stormy night in a log cabin in the backwoods to a single mother. And
But, yeah, but that aspect of it, I mean, the deal that's made about that by this New York Times journalist and by Tom Kasich is really sort of beside the point. I mean, sure, these narratives go on, and there's this underlying criticism, well, isn't this silly? But this is what the media, this is what the media expects from people. This is what the media allows. So we have to see, even if insofar, I don't think even anyone like this Mark Leibovich can sort of back off and say, well, I'm not a part of this. The New York Times is a part of this. Of course they are, in their general coverage of political campaigns. They can hardly claim to be innocent of looking into people's background and equating their character, how far they have risen or what they have done in terms of making money or whatever, in terms of their qualifications. So this is the way our system works, and so it was sort of a superficial approach to really more fundamental problems, which include the media itself.
There's a study out just this week done by a group of people at Princeton and Northwestern that I will put on our Facebook page. And in fact, you probably were going to mention that in your list, so I'll just
I have
touch
too
on
much
it.
else.
Well, I'll just touch on it. The point they come to, and this is a long sort of political science statistical study of voting behavior and American public attitudes and this nature of elections. And the conclusion is unequivocal. The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. What we're talking about here today is how that happens, why an election is carried out in which the issues are not mentioned, and that the issues that will be followed on the crucial questions literally of life and death, who the government's going to kill, the government's going to allow to die. These are essentially agreed upon by the quote, serious candidates, close quote. And it's only unserious candidates like our friend David who are willing to cast an occasional stone at Goliath. So it's I'm very glad you did it.
Yep.
But the situation you ran into is not unique.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't want anybody to think that I'm making a fetish. I mean, there's something silly about elections. There's something silly about getting people to vote for you. Just the whole concept of I vote for you. It seems like sixth grade for some reason.
Right.
Elections look more and more like a high school popularity contest.
Yeah, but even just, I mean, the idea of, as opposed to people governing themselves.
Exactly.
As opposed to voting for somebody to govern them, when of course we know that they're being voted for to govern them on behalf of much more wealthy and privileged people than most of the people voting. So in that sense, I mean, we really have to think about I mean, I've been reading some stuff lately that's much more critical of how democracy arose in its current form of electoral politics and what that involves, and how that is really how the way we have elections is really complicit in the corporate power structure. It is like we learn to think that there's these sort of balancing forces. There's sort of capitalism on one hand, and democracy on the other hand, but they're really, of course, part of the same system, and democracy reflects that, and electoral politics is meant to sort of trivialize the notion of self-government to the extent that, as Carl, as you said, people aren't really involved in that.
Suppose, though, instead of the election about the personalities and the dishwashing abilities of Ms. Callis and Mr. Gollum and yourself.
Miss Callis's grandmother, I might add, but anyway, yes.
Wash the dishes, yes.
But if it had not been about that, suppose that the election was faceless, that we didn't know these people, that what we did is we went out and consulted the electorate in the 13th Congressional District on how they felt about various issues. How did they feel about the government's providing a living wage job for anyone who needed one? How did they feel about the government providing medical care for people who need it? How did they feel about the government providing education for people who need it? How do they feel about the government ending the war? How do they feel, indeed, even about how what the government is doing in the Middle East in regard to support for the state of Israel? I think on each of these things you would have gotten clear answers from the electorate, and the positions they would have taken were the positions you were arguing for, not the positions that your opponents were arguing for. And there wouldn't even have been a contest. I mean, it would be 80% on each of those issues. You know, yes, that's what people do want. But in fact, what we have is a system of personalities and whatnot, of popularity contests, as Ron says, that and of advertising competitions. As Noam Chomsky points out, remember the people who bring you the election is the same people who sell you toothpaste. Yeah. And what we have here is a competition that has nothing to do with the things the government will actually do. And if it did, the government would do quite different things from what it's doing.
Yeah. But it really mostly, I would reassure that it's mostly about money. I mean, even the fact that I was the best-looking candidate didn't seem to help me.
And you brush your teeth more often. But
right.
No. You're watching Aware on the Air, where it's getting silly. We'll go perhaps to Ron Zoke, and I've even misplaced your title.
The Hawk.
Oh, yeah, well,
The hawk flies.
the hawks scream and the eagle stirs. So,
Sort of like Winston Churchill or something.
That's what we need.
yeah. Okay, well, I don't have a corresponding narrative, unfortunately. I need to punch one up, I guess. And actually, I did wash dishes for
Did you? I was
years
gonna say.
at the Pilgrim Restaurant in Normal, Illinois. But,
There you go.
But
Putting
hey,
our credentials on the table.
Yeah,
or
right,
at
right.
least in the dishwasher.
yeah. But unfortunately, after that, I went nowhere. So, so anyway,
Elijah early promise.
yeah. I want to mention several things centering on Russia, Cuba, Africa, and that should be enough. The narratives of opposition to Russia stopping Putin are becoming ever louder and insistent. And here are some interesting remarks, I think, about the whole situation. The Hawks demanding that Obama stand up to Putin and show that he has a pair. So Simon Johnson, professor of economics at MIT, says the rhetoric of confrontation with Russia seems to be escalating, including the remarkable suggestion from Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, that the U.S. provide small arms and radio equipment to Ukraine. Encouragement for a military confrontation is not what Ukraine needs, Johnson says. As Peter Boone and I have argued in a pair of recent columns in the New York Times, Ukraine needs economic reform with a massive reduction in corruption as the top priority. This reform requires, above all, a massive and immediate reduction in or elimination of corruption, which is what I think any Ukrainian who knows what's going on would tell you. The government now in Kiev, the Putsch government, says nothing about this, but it's well known. Even Tymoshenko, the woman with the braids, is rejected by a great majority of the Ukrainian citizens because they know she's as deeply mired in the corruption as any one of her fellow oligarchs there. So I invite you to look into that if you think there's some doubt or question about what I'm saying. Changing the scene to Cuba and raising the instance of the so-called Cuban Twitter. The U.S. created, according to BBC News, a text message social network designed to foment unrest in Cuba, according to an investigation by the Associated Press news agency. It was called Zuzinio, a Cuban Twitter had 40,000 subscribers at its height in the country with limited web access. The project reportedly lasted from 2009 2009 to 2012 when the grant money ran out. The U.S. is said to have concealed its links to the network through a series of shell companies and by funneling messages through other countries. So the idea was that you set up something without government approval and indeed secretly, covertly, in Cuba, a lot like Twitter, and allow the young people there to use it. And at first you start with sports stuff and entertainment fluff, and the idea was that months later, after a whole lot of young people started tuning into this, that you started the political stuff and the agitation against the Cuban government and trying to stir up some resistance. And that's the story that we're getting now. The idea was that unrest and resistance could be created within Cuba, subversion of the Cuban government by this means. And interesting point is that this was supported by USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, which has always claimed that it doesn't take part in activities like this intended to subvert, overthrow, or discredit other governments, that it's purely for economic aid and development. And they're still claiming that, by the way, that there was nothing really covert about this project, which seems to be obviously false. But we're waiting for a report on this. The USAID spokesman, Matt Herrick, told the BBC the agency was proud of its work in Cuba and that it worked to help people everywhere to exercise their rights and connect them with the outside world. See, we were doing it for idealistic motives. Quoting, the implementation has the government taking steps to be discreet in non-permissive environments. Of course, he said. That's how you protect the practitioners and the public. In hostile environments, we often take steps to protect the partners we're working with on the ground. This is not unique to Cuba. So this suggests that other projects, secret, covert projects of a propaganda nature are going elsewhere, and we're protecting the people there who are cooperating with us by keeping it secret and engaging in discreet language. Havana reveals more U.S. attempts to influence Cubans. The U.S. Agency for International Development, the administrator Ravi Shah, has been testifying about this in the Senate Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs. And he was questioned about this, but didn't really admit anything that could be damaging. Al Jazeera has obtained some documents showing that the private firm that was engaged to do this was given classification of secret level security clearance. And again, if this were not covert, how could this possibly have happened? Anyway, so there's the case of Cuba, and of course everyone in Washington and USAID is claiming innocence, and to be very indignant about anyone blowing their cover. Meanwhile, the U.S. on Friday, this slammed, very useful journalistic word, plans to construct a EU-centric communication system. In other words, the threat is that Europe will set up its own network, which will be independent of American control. And this is being opposed by the USA. The NSA is warning that such a move is a violation of trade laws, calling Europe's proposal to build its own integrated communication system draconian. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative said American tech companies, which are worth an estimated $8 trillion per year, would take a financial hit if Brussels gave the initiative the green light, if they tried to declare that degree of independence. Quoting recent proposals from countries within the European Union to create a Europe-only electronic network, dubbed a Schengen cloud by advocates, or to create a national-only electronic networks, could potentially lead to effective exclusion or discrimination against foreign service suppliers that are directly offering network services or dependent on them, the U.S. Trade Representative said in its actual report. So that may cut us out from some of the profits that are to be made from this, and mean that we no longer could control it. Concerning Russia, the head of NATO was interviewed for the situation. The head of NATO says Europe has misread Vladimir Putin for years and now must scramble to push back against the Kremlin's widening ambitions. So this guy, Rasmussen, the head of NATO, is extremely aggressive. He's demonizing Putin and the Russians and telling us what they're really up to. This is appearing in the local press as well. March 26th, guest commentary by one Andres Oppenheimer. Aggressive Putin may soon expand into South America. Right. So another fluff piece. I think we should all be properly suspicious anytime that a story contains the word may or might or possibly or so on. It's full of speculation. Ask yourself when you try to read something like this, how much of this stuff is subject to fact-checking by a reasonably tough-minded person. And you'll find that there's not very much of it. About 95% of the supposed news columns in your newspaper, I think you'll find, are actually full of speculation about what other people will do, of imputing motives and intentions to them, which in some cases may be right, but you have no way of knowing that. And you're getting someone's speculation about what may happen or could happen or might happen, and that's, of course, welcome for anyone to speculate about. Final point, Germany, again, the U.S. military is averaging more than a mission a day in Africa, according to this article in Tom Dispatch. Yeah. The numbers tell the story. 10 exercises, 55 operations, 481 security operations, security cooperation activities, and so on. For years, the U.S. military has publicly insisted that its efforts in Africa are small scale, whatever that means. And there is on the record now, this is coming from RT, Russian television. You won't find it in any American mainstream media source. The U.S. operates a drone war from German premises in its Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The entire drone war of the U.S. military wouldn't be possible without Germany. This guy, former Air Force drone pilot who resigned in 2011. Last year, German media revealed that the U.S. uses its military bases in Germany to conduct targeted killings of suspected terrorists in Somalia. But this guy now says that the Ramstein Air Base in the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate is involved in strikes over a large part of Africa. So I guess I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Ron. You might also say that when you're quoting Andreas Oppenheimer about these matters, that it's also worthwhile to look at, how did you put it, the motives and intentions of the authors of these media pieces, the motives and intentions of the speculators, we might say, and I want to insist on the ambiguity of the term. Oppenheimer is based in a Florida newspaper and has for years writing about the imminent threats to America from Castro's Cuba and Chavez Venezuela. So,
Yeah. He's
well,
notorious for his reporting, supposed reporting from Venezuela. Yeah.
Exactly. So, comments on Ron's animadversions?
Did you have anything, David?
You go first if you have something.
I was just going to mention that kind of tangentially, related to the drones in particular, the ACLU had their annual lunch this past Sunday, and they had a speaker speaking on privacy and security issues, and privacy and how we should defend it. And it's not really important who the speaker was. You can look it up if you're interested. But there were only a couple points that I just wanted to bring up. He had mentioned Maryland versus Smith as a Supreme Court case in which basically if you hand over your information to a third party, then the Supreme Court says that you are making it public. It becomes public. It should be public at that point. So like if you are using a phone company and you're using their stuff in order to make a phone call to talk to someone, that since the phone company has that information, then that information is public. And that sort of thing is what he was saying is going to lead there. So if you give it to Facebook, then and you're making up, actually, if you give it to like Google, and Google then makes it public, then it was public because you gave it to the third party. Okay. So what he was saying, in order to secure our privacy and fight against the increasing use of, we need to have less privacy in order to make our lives more secure or the country more secure. He said that he's not so sure about legislation using to combat that. That's only one prong and it won't work because legislation gets knocked down the next time that someone votes on something, and that the way to maintain our privacy is to constantly have civic pressure to not violate our privacy. And but that kind of, he didn't say this, but this is my criticism of that, is that that requires a lot of transparency. And we don't have that legislated, and so without companies telling us what they're doing, or if the NSA doesn't tell us what they're doing, then we have no way of doing the civic pressure in order to keep our privacy as privacy. And I guess I'll stop there. But basically, the drones, the increasing use of drones, both internationally and domestically, for all sorts of things, is an invasion on all sorts of, privacy issues in addition to everything else. Yes, I'm sorry, Dave?
No, otherwise known as fundamental rights, you mean?
Yes, those.
Yeah.
Yeah, remember those?
The drone point is worthwhile, I think, underlining in regard to the very important article that from Nick Turse that Ron referred to about the war that the U.S. is carrying on in Africa. Turse says in his article, he quotes a American official saying, we've essentially been at war in Africa for 2.5 years. Well, actually, in some ways, it's been more. It goes back to the invasion of Somalia and the importance of Somalia as an approach to the Middle East that all recent administrations have taken seriously. The most Americans know about that probably is from the movie Black Hawk Down.
Yeah.
But that occurred because the U.S. at the time was essentially making sure that a government that we liked emerged in Somalia, and we've been willing to do a great number of things, including invade the country twice, in order to secure that result. Ron's point about the drones from Ramstein in Germany hitting Somalia arises in part from the fact that AFRICOM the African Command, the Pentagon's organization of the war in Africa, is unable to convince any African country to house their operations. Therefore, they have to be housed in Germany. Now, this at the time, the Pentagon is spending an immense amount of money, spreading an immense amount of money around. The Obama administration has expanded greatly what the Bush administration did in Africa in order to buy militaries. This is an American tradition going back to the period after the Second World War, where the U.S. approach to a country, particularly one we want to, where we want to overthrow the elected government, like Chile in '73, the approach to the country is simply to purchase the military. And use the military for our purposes. The School of Americas and its horrible record of producing torturers and murderers is the central, but not the only, organ in the American system of subverting governments by means of their militaries. And the situation of Africa right now is quite desperate. Once again, not known to Americans, while the Obama administration busily ramps up the war throughout Africa, not just in East Africa, not just in Somalia, not just in the north either, but throughout the country. And this at a time when nothing short of a genocide has been going on in Central Africa, which we're finding more and more is bound up with American policy. The recent anniversary of the real genocide in Rwanda has produced some more information about the responsibility of the United States for the outbreak of that genocide and its support for the murderous government that has succeeded to in Rwanda and is responsible for a good deal of the depredations in the Congo at the moment. So it's once again, stories that we don't know, that we should know, and that our government knows and is busy about, but they want to be quiet about it.
And think of all the money that we spend subverting other countries' governments and providing education for military people, like the School of Americas, or whatever the name of the School of the Assassins.
Yeah, they changed the name so we wouldn't know it.
But all the money that we give for military aid to different countries, if we just spent that money on jobs here, say like, putting more teachers and decreasing the class sizes in high schools, for instance, how much we could do a lot of good instead of constantly subverting other countries' military governments and supporting military overthrows and tyranny. Sorry.
I was looking when they started observing the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, I guess early last week. I was sort of looking for an alternative narrative, pardon to keep using this word so much. Even on the left, even on Democracy Now!, I didn't really find it. I did find it, but I kind of had to look for it. Yep. And even then I was not satisfied, even on the left, even on the websites I usually read and look for Counterpunch or Common Dreams or ZNet. Kind of an interesting lack of criticism or confusion, or maybe just lack of understanding. It all seems to, for some, it all seems to hinge on who shot down the plane on April 6th, whatever, 1994, that precipitated the Rwandan genocide, whether it was the Hutu or Tutsi faction, and where it went from there. And there's a real split in the left, maybe an understandable one, in terms of what we call whether we even call the Rwandan genocide a genocide, which Edward Herman, who is Noam Chomsky's well-known collaborator, would either, I hope I'm representing him properly, but he's written a book several years ago called The Politics of Genocide, in which he tries to sort of debunk the notion this was a genocide, or at least in comparative terms to say what's happened in the Congo since then, and also challenging whether it was a genocide precipitated pretty much by U.S. policies in supporting the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and Paul Kagame, who was in Uganda at that time. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarification on the left, even on the Chomskyan left, as to what went down in 1994, and so it sort of, there seemed to be an avoidance of grappling with that in the last couple of weeks, insofar as anybody even wanted to. So I was interested to know if any of you had any reaction to that or to my concerns about that.
Well, of course, it's no accident that we don't know much about it, because the federal government, this administration and previous ones, have done a great deal to hide what in fact they're doing. These are not policy decisions taken in some public or democratic fashion
Yeah.
by the United States. This is secret murders carried out by our government for purposes of for the interests of a very small minority of Americans who will essentially make money from it. And the scandal here is that this is a standard operating procedure. This is the way of doing business. It's at least as ancient as the Reagan administration, when the Reagan administration tried to do in Central America what the Kennedy administration had done in Southeast Asia, that is, use military force to suppress governments that were not willing to follow orders from Washington about their economic development. The Reagan administration found in the early 80s, to its horror, that it couldn't do, that it didn't have the freedom to act openly and publicly as John Kennedy did in 1962 when he began the carpet bombing of South Vietnam. They found they had to drive, that essentially America war-making had been driven underground by popular outrage in the United States, and they had to do it secretly and through proxies. They managed to kill millions of people. In other words, the job got done, but was done in a different fashion. It was done secretly. Now, this is a you have to say, in some sense, it's an advance, even though the number of bodies continue to pile up. But when we come to the question of American policy in Africa 20 years ago or today, we're living in this world in which the American government has to hide from the American population what it's doing in their name. Because, of course, it's not doing it in their interests or in the interests of its victims in Africa.
But why does the media go along with it? I think that may...
Yeah. No,
I mean, why aren't they covering the most stories that I heard about Rwanda this past, over the anniversary was about the guy who owned the hotel who took in a lot of people and actually basically got them protected by, yeah.
They don't want to come into conflict with rich and powerful people.
They're owned by rich and powerful people
Yes,
in those cases,
yes.
too.
But NPR, I mean, they're supposed to not be, but look who they...
Who is NPR working for?
Right, and who do they say at the end, this is sponsored by, without advertisements, but yeah, go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
I think that the one, there's a journalist named Andrei Vilcek who's published a lot on Counterpunch, and he's not so much taking a stand on the Rwandan genocide, or he's trying to attribute at least whatever involvement the U.S. had in that, in supporting the RPF, and perhaps supporting the fact that it was they who shot down the plane that precipitated this whole thing. But what he's at least trying to do is to put it in the context of what's going on in the DCR, the Democratic Republic of is it? I'm sorry, do they call it DRC or the DCR? Whatever, the Congo.
French or
Yeah, right,
English.
right. What's gone in there for the last few years overwhelms that number, but it's not referred to as genocide, and so that therefore is what Edward Herman's. And the guy who wrote this book with David Peterson, who have been vilified since writing that book the last 3 or 4 years, and it's hard to know whether Herman and Peterson have quote unquote gone too far in debunking the notion of a Rwandan genocide in the way this narrative has been told, but clearly they're right in emphasizing the ongoing genocide in Congo that is not covered and that is not mentioned in the context of this 20th anniversary view.
But this is not an isolated case. Compare Diana Johnstone's book about the Serbian, the American attack on Serbia. Now, that exists in the American imaginary as a splendid attempt by the Clinton administration to stop genocide in Serbia. Well, you know, that's a complete lie. There's nothing to it at all. And yet, a serious account of what the U.S. was doing in Serbia, which looks very much like what the U.S. is doing in other places as well, that can't be given. You're watching Aware on the Air. They are calling us from all over, apparently, and that's all of the good.
I think, they must have heard the word genocide once too often. But
we're genocide light here, you know.
And the pressure to go into to fight Russia right now is all about. They're going to use the same reasoning for that.
Yeah, this is. I must admit, I'm a little surprised at the belligerent tone that being taken towards Russia in regard to Ukraine. This morning's Financial Times, the economic paper from London, carries a really quite a bitter editorial about how Putin has to be opposed in Ukraine. Putin's Insidious Tactics in Ukraine, it's entitled. Now, I'm not quite sure what they're doing here. The Financial Times people, who are usually very clear-eyed and clear-headed on these things, know perfectly well the economic ties in Germany and elsewhere that make a resolution of any problems in Ukraine in the interests of both the EU and Russia, and apparently there to the U.S. as well. Now, whether the U.S. really thinks it can advance its NATOification of Europe and the increasing control of the European economy, which clearly is part of the Obama administration's policy, whether they think they can do this by promoting the opposition to Russia in regard to Ukraine or not, I don't know. But we need a microphone on somebody here? We're all okay. Yeah.
okay.
You're watching Aware on the Air. I have only a couple of minutes left, and I would like to mention one story which I must admit shocked me just a bit this week, and that's hard to do these days. Ron mentioned earlier AID as a cover for the Agency for International Development, as a cover for the CIA. People are suddenly discovering, here's the CIA being covered by the AID in various places. This, of course, goes back to at least 2 generations.
Yes.
AID has been, for years, a preferred cover for the CIA, so much so that people in AID even got upset about it on occasion because they were being targeted as CIA operatives, which in many cases they were. But the story this week that struck me on this came from the CIA's favorite newspaper, the Washington Post, and it described how the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Phoebes, the FBI, who are in the news this week in part because of their involvement in the Boston Marathon explosions that were being commemorated in Boston today. The FBI shot in the head one of the associates of the presumed bombers in what was supposed to be an interrogation session. If you want to see an account of this, you have to go to places like Counterpunch to see what the FBI is doing in killing people like this, and questions about the FBI's role in the entire Boston Marathon bombing. But the story that emerged this week in the Washington Post was that the FBI has formed an alliance with the Joint Special Operations Command. You remember that presidential secret army that we have active in 130 countries around the world? The FBI has an alliance with JSOC and has deployed agents in hundreds of raids conducted as part of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is continuing to do so throughout the Middle East. This is JSOC, I mentioned earlier, Retired General Barry McCaffrey has referred to them as, quote, the most dangerous people on the face of the earth. They are, in effect, American death squads. And it was the Washington Post, not some lefty journal, that is telling us about the FBI's involvement with and activities as part of these American death squads. The JSOC apparently particularly wanted the FBI in order to exploit, quote, digital media and other materials to locate insurgents and detect plots, including any against the United States. Wait a minute. In return, the FBI could preserve evidence and maintain a chain of custody should any suspect be transferred to the United States for trial. That's Washington Post speak for kidnapping and the rendition that has been the stock and trade of JSOC. The agents, the FBI agents who participated in these military raids, came from the FBI's Hostage and Rescue Team, HRT, pronounced HURT, FBI HURT. As the Post recounted, ties between the FBI and the military have deepened in recent decades. The FBI has trained with Navy SEALs in Virginia and California. FBI HURT deployed to Panama prior to U.S. invention in 1989, so this isn't recent. They are also part of the 1993 botched assault on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, which some people are remembering this week because of other activities.
In Nevada?
In Nevada,
Yeah.
exactly. An operation against a white separatist compound in Ruby Ridge, Idaho. So this tie-up between the FBI and American death squads, the American president's private army, is not new, but it's expanded in the Obama administration to quite apparently surprising dimensions, according to the account on the Washington Post. The account on the Washington Post is like the account we had last year from the New York Times about the president's Terror Tuesdays and the president picking out people to be killed with drones. It's in a standard paper, and the question is, why does the administration, which means that the administration wanted this article to be there, and the question is, why were they willing to do it? The purpose of the article, the purpose behind the article, as Ron mentioned earlier in another connection, is always a question to be asked, particularly with statements like this in papers of record. Concluding comments, we're about out of time.
I just, one thing I've been sort of wanting to say is that along with this whole anti-Putin thing, just this ongoing notion of American prestige that's always invoked in these, to sort of limit the debate in this context, like credibility, prestige. Right. Those are the kind of things, once we start talking about that, then we're not questioning what it is, why we need prestige in the first place, and what that really means. There is a belligerent tone in what's going on now that seems, since the whole Ukraine thing, that seems remarkable and seems dangerous and threatening beyond what we're used to. To me, it's kind of symbolized by Jay Carney. I don't know why, because he's just a front man, but there's just something about the way Jay Carney represents the views of the State Department or of the White House that is just particularly frightening to me.
The ascendancy of the flag. You've been listening to Aware on the Air. Our thanks to Jason and Yosef for production and direction. Thanks to them also. This program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and you can reach them by going to our Facebook page. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zote, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, David Green, other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.